My name is Justin Clement. Welcome to another Lunch and Learn talk hosted by the Valley Forge Park Alliance. We have a great talk today called Valley Forge from A to Z. Before we begin, I do invite our listeners to visit vfparkalliance.org, our website where you can view our event calendar, find out about future Lunch and Learn talks. We're here every Wednesday at noon between now and mid-August. You can also view other events going on at the park, and you can view recordings of past Lunch and Learn talks in this series. Now, apart from that, on Zoom, if you go into the speaker view rather than gallery view, it will probably improve your viewing experience. The icon is typically in the upper right-hand corner. Apart from that, I also would like to stress that this is a more conversational series. If you have any questions, we welcome you to put them into the Q&A box. The links are at the bottom of the screen. Ask any questions as you go along. I will be monitoring the Q&A, and as the moderator, I will be introducing those questions as we go along. If you have any more detailed questions and you want to hold off to the end, that's okay too. But it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Nancy K. Loane. She is a former seasonal park ranger at Valley Forge National Historical Park. I should note that she was also my predecessor in planning the speaker series, I believe the Lunch and Learn series as well. So we have been very fortunate to have her as a dedicated volunteer over the years. She continues to volunteer with the park as well as the Valley Forge Park Alliance, and either as a interpretive ranger or docent at the park or in many other capacities. She's author of the book Following the Drum, Women at the Valley Forge Encampment, which is an excellent resource if you want to learn more about those women who were present at the encampment following the Continental Army. She also gives talks on Martha Washington, as well as various officers who had written letters from Valley Forge. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Nancy K. Loane. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks so much, Justin. And I think we're going to, I'm going to be moving off the screen, and my tech guy here, my wonderful husband, Tom, is going to get us started. Just a moment.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so what we're going to be doing today is taking a romp through the alphabet. And the topic of the talk here is Valley Forge from A to Z. As I mentioned, my husband, Tom, who you can sort of see him on the side here, is been very helpful in many, many ways. And certainly today in getting everything set up for me. So thanks, honey, I appreciate it very much. And thanks to you, Justin, too, for this wonderful opportunity, and to those of you who are listening. Valley Forge is really very important to me and has been for many, many years. And I'm happy to share this little romp, as I said, through the alphabet with all of you. So let's get started. Just a second. I have a little technical difficulty here. Page down. All right, Valley Forge from A to Z. I always like to start with Valley Forge 101. Kind of what is Valley Forge and where was Valley Forge? Well, we know 3,600 acres outside of Philadelphia, beautiful location. The Washington soldiers marched in on December the 19th of 1777 and left on June the 19th of 1778. So they were at Valley Forge for 6 months. This is the third of the 8 winter encampments during the Revolutionary War. We have about, well, we don't really know how many soldiers came to Valley Forge. Just a few months ago, I would say there would be 11 or 12,000, but now we have a new article. Maybe you've seen it, some of you. It's called Reconsideration of the Continental Army Numerical Strength at Valley Forge. It puts the number of, I see Justin nodding his head, it puts the number of soldiers that came to Valley Forge at 18 or 19,000. So
yes, we're actually going to have them invited on as speakers in the series later this summer. So stay tuned if you're interested in learning a bit more about the numerical strength of the Army. We're going to be going into that in detail at a later talk.
I think this is great and very interesting, Justin. Didn't you find this article very interesting?
Yes, quite convincing in many ways too. But it takes a long time for people to kind of accept a change. So
I know.
we'll see how things shake out.
I know. I too am looking forward to seeing what happens with that. So perhaps we're not as sure as we thought we were about how many men walked in, nor are we quite sure really how many women came with General Washington's army here at Valley Forge either. In my book, Following the Drowned Women at the Valley Forge Encampment, I put it at about 400, considering one ration per woman, and that would be, they say about 400 rations were given out early December. But if the rations were a half ration per women, that would put the number of women that came to Valley Forge at around 800. So we're really not sure, frankly, how many women came with the Army at Valley Forge. We do know that Valley Forge is after the Philadelphia campaign. Of course, we have the Battle of Brandywine, we have the Battle of Germantown, the Battle of Paoli, none of which really went well. They actually called the massacre at Paoli, none of which went well. And Washington soldiers come to Valley Forge after this. Now, of course, Washington is losing in Pennsylvania. On the other hand, Gates is being extremely successful up in New York with the Battle of Saratoga against Brandywine. So we have a little discussion here. Who is the better general? And as we start down the our alphabet, we come to A for Benedict Arnold. I mentioned Benedict Arnold and Saratoga because he, of course, was at Saratoga and is considered very instrumental in that battle there. He also came to Valley Forge in May. He brought General Knox's wife, Lucy, to Valley Forge, along with their little daughter, little Lucy, who was about 2 years old when she came to Valley Forge. And he signed this oath of allegiance to the United States of America at Valley Forge. He signed the oath of allegiance to the United States of America at Valley Forge. But how much did that really mean to him? Because we all know on 1780, he turned traitor to his country. He turned over West Point, or wanted to turn over West Point to the British Army. So how much did the United States of America really mean to him? And how much did signing this oath of allegiance mean to Benedict Arnold? And so, as I said, you may hiss here at this point. Washington was extremely, thank you, thanks, Justin. Washington was extremely concerned and upset at this betrayal by Benedict Arnold. He says that no terms can describe the baseness of his heart, meaning the baseness of Benedict Arnold's heart. So A is for Benedict Arnold. And as I said, you may hiss now, he signs the oath of allegiance, but how much does it mean to him? Not very much. Let's look at B, and we have a totally different general here. This is Baron de Steuben. I say Baron de Steuben because that is what he was called in America. And in Europe, he apparently was called Baron von Steuben. As a seasonal ranger, I was taught to say von Steuben. Bill Trotman taught us how to do that. But in looking at the records, we see that Baron Steuben signs his oath of allegiance at Valley Forge as Baron de Steuben. D.E. Steuben. He also makes out several wills when he is in America, 2 of them, in fact. In both of the wills that he has and makes out and signs in America, he signs himself as Baron de Steuben. So I am on a little soapbox here and have written a chapter in my new book about the name change and about this very exciting man, Baron Steuben, and why we should be calling him and honoring him as Baron de Steuben for all he did for America, rather than calling him Baron von Steuben, which he never even calls himself in America. What were his contributions to our army? Well, everything. Valley Forge is known as the birthplace of the American Army. He comes to Valley Forge, he trains the soldiers, and the army that marches out is a different army than that marches into Valley Forge. He comes to Valley Forge with his secretary, a French cook. The French cook takes one look around and says, "Non, non, non," and leaves. He also comes with his dog and an entourage of several people. Steuben could swear in several languages. Soldiers loved him because they knew that this man really cared about him. And Steuben admired them. He writes to some of his colleagues in Europe saying, "You train your soldier by saying, do this, and he does it. I, on the other hand, have to explain to my soldier why he should do it that way, and then he will do it." Nevertheless, Steuben really admired the American soldier. And once he came to Valley Forge, as the soldiers write, it was a continual drill because of Baron Steuben, the birthplace of the American Army, Valley Forge. Let's talk for a minute about C. C is for camp followers, or the camp women that came to Valley Forge. As I mentioned, we really don't know how many there were, somewhere probably between 400 and 800 of them. And what were they doing here at Valley Forge? Well, we know that some of them served as nurses, some of them were cooks, some of them were washerwomen, some of the women did some sewing and mending for Washington. Washington, however, thought very, very little of the camp women, although he needed them for his army. Washington's soldiers were not happy about doing the washing for themselves. They wanted someone else to take care of that, and that was the women. So if Washington wanted to have a clean army, which he did, he needed the women to take care of the laundry. And as I mentioned, several other tasks over. Probably one of the very first people that were killed at the Valley Forge Encampment was a woman. It was one of our officers' writes on December the 19th of 1777. On this day, a woman was killed. She was riding in a wagon, probably the wagon overturned, and she was killed underneath. The officers didn't think much of these camp women either, the women that came with their husbands. And they said instead that this is a caravan of wild beasts that is with the army. And Washington calls the camp women a clog upon every movement. Yet, as I said, Washington really needed the camp women, the camp followers here at Valley Forge. Let's talk about the weather. Damp and muddy. We see many, many pictures of Valley Forge. Many of them are in snow, ice. Yes, there were snowy days. Yes, there were icy days at Valley Forge, but we also find when you really look at the temperatures, and we know the temperatures from a man named Thomas Coombe, C-O-O-M-B-E, who took a record of the temperatures during that time, not at Valley Forge, but nearby. There are only 10 days when the thermometer during the Valley Forge encampment period is at 10 degrees or below. So this was not an incredibly hard, difficult, icy, snowy winter. What happened though was when it got snowy and icy, and there were some days like that, undoubtedly, then the temperature would rise and the snow and ice would melt and it would become damp and muddy. There's mud up to my ankles, one of the soldiers wrote from Valley Forge. There's mud up to my knees, another one wrote. What was the problem here? And as you can see by the picture, it would be very difficult to get the wagons bringing the supplies to Valley Forge through this damp, muddy roads. So we need to, in thinking about the myths of Valley Forge, take away the idea of the ice and snow instead of putting in a damp and muddy winter at the Valley Forge Encampment. And that is the Valley Forge Encampment. Let's look at E, and E is for entertainment. And this is where I really became interested in the Valley Forge Encampment in my own research. Because in looking in the primary documents and the letters and the journals and the diaries of the time, what I find was that Martha Washington attended the camp theater. She was part of a numerous and splendid audience that went to see Cato, one of Washington's favorite plays, performed at Valley Forge. And for me, this just exploded the whole idea of the encampment and what went on there, because we find that theater productions were held at Valley Forge. You usually don't think of theater productions and Valley Forge together in the same statement, in the same sentence, and yet that too is part of Valley Forge. We also find dice. The archaeologists have found dice at Valley Forge, some of them made out of musket balls. Washington himself didn't think very much about gambling, which dice would be part of, perhaps. He called it a pernicious practice. He didn't think much of gambling. And yet this is what his soldiers were doing at Valley Forge. And we know that because we find dice there at camp. We also find for entertainment that General Knox is playing ball with the soldiers near the artillery park, and that Washington himself has took up the bat at a game of cricket that they held at Valley Forge. So not only was it a continuous drill at camp, but there was also some entertainment that was going on at the Valley Forge encampment. Let's look at our next letter, F, the Feu de Joie, the fire of joy. When you go to Valley Forge, you drive down Route 23 and you see the statue of Steuben standing off, and stand there and look out over the field. And when you do that, maybe you can put in your mind's eye thousands of soldiers holding muskets, cannon in the background. And then you would see on the 6th of May of 1777, a glorious Feu de Joie, the fire of joy. 13, and of course it would have to be 13, that's the number during the Revolutionary time. 13 cannon boom out, and then there's a signal, and one by one, the soldiers fire off their muskets, running down the front line, and then running back on the second line. It's hard to imagine exactly what this looked like, but we certainly can imagine what this must have sounded like, because one after one, these muskets would have fired off in a Feu de Joie practice, probably a long time before they actually staged it, and Steuben made sure that happened. And then the soldiers, after the cannon went off, fired one right after another, they would shout out, "Huzzah for the friendly French powers." Smoke is all over the field of the Grand Parade. Once again, the cannon boom out, all 13 of them. Once again, the signal is given and the soldiers fire off their muskets one by one, right after another. And then they say, "Huzzah to the friendly European powers." And then for the third time, we hear the cannons booming out, the soldiers firing off one right after another. By this time, the place is covered with smoke. Huzzah to the United States of America. Happiness beams on every countenance, because they know that France have joined with them against the British. And at this time, they recognized that America will become victorious. Some of them wrote, we will be able to go home very soon. Instead, the war would go on for 5 more years. But once that French alliance was formed, Britain too knew that America would win. So a glorious day on May the 6th of 1778, when under Steuben's direction, the army fires the Feu de Joie in the Grand Parade. Let's look for our next letter of the alphabet. G, General Nathanael Greene. Greene was a Quaker from Rhode Island. He had absolutely no intention nor any desire whatsoever to become the quartermaster for Washington. Several times he turned down that offer. But finally, Greene gave in and he became the quartermaster for Washington, and things changed for the army because he was excellent at putting things together. General Greene was also very much enamored with his wife. Her name was Katie. He wrote her lovely little letters. He called her my angel. Katie came to Valley Forge, one of the several ladies that come to the Valley Forge Encampment. And probably as an award to Greene, to thank him for what he did in becoming the quartermaster and really changing that office around. General Nathanael Greene became the commander of the Southern troops. And there were several years of war, of course, for the Southern troops, and he was the man who commanded that. So General Nathanael Greene, a big friend of Washington's, great supporter of General Washington, the Continental Army, and the cause, a man very much in love with Katie, a beautiful woman, his angel, as he calls him, totally changes the quartermaster department at Valley Forge, and very instrumental in the success of camp. Washington, when he comes to Valley Forge, says unless some great and capital change takes place, this army is going to disperse or dissolve. But partially because of General Nathanael Greene, that did not happen. And of course, we're very grateful for that. Let's talk about the huts at the Valley Forge Encampment. This was the very first thing that the Army needed to do. And just recently, there was a wonderful talk about the huts here at Valley Forge. For the first time, the first location ever in the world, the Army, any Army, made their own huts for them to live at during the winter encampment period. Before, the soldiers had built it in tents or in homes. But this is the first time, Valley Forge, that the soldiers had to construct their own houses. And they did that soon after, and started that soon after they came into the Valley Forge Encampment. Washington was extremely specific about how he wanted these huts to be built. 14 by 16, the side wall 6.5 feet tall, fireplace opposite the door. He gave directions about the roofing for the huts. Also mentioned, though, that there's a contest, and whoever could figure out a wonderful way to roof the huts would be given $100, which was an enormous amount of money at the time. Washington also set up a competition for the soldiers, and he said the hut that was the first built in the brigade and built to specifications and of good construction, each man would get $1 for his efforts. So huts, very important to get done, and certainly the first thing that the soldiers had to do when they marched into Valley Forge on December the 19th of 1777. When these huts went up, and there were about 2,000 of them, Valley Forge becomes one of the largest cities in North America. The soldiers, of course, find their huts very comfortable. And I say, of course, because we wouldn't think the huts would be particularly comfortable, but the soldiers said we're quite comfortable in them. Only problem was, apparently the roofing situation was never really solved, because when it did rain, the soldiers would complain that it would be as wet inside the hut as it was outside the hut. So we had some problems with the roofing. But the first job of the soldiers, build their huts, and they were to be built to very specific specifications. Let's talk about inoculation. We, of course, have been inoculated against COVID. Washington wanted to have all his soldiers inoculated against smallpox. This was a personal thing for him, for he himself had had smallpox, and he knew what a disease it was and wanted all his soldiers to be inoculated against it. Initially, he had wanted all the soldiers inoculated before they came to Valley Forge. But then he realized that there was a certain period of time that the soldiers had to rest after the inoculation. It meant that they would get a very mild case of the disease. So eventually he would have the soldiers, new recruits, new soldiers brought to Valley Forge and then inoculated them at camp. Encampment was an excellent time to do an inoculation because the soldiers were pretty much stationary at that point. And so it was an excellent time for inoculation to take place. As I mentioned, they needed to rest after the time. In March, for example, Washington had 3,000 men under inoculation at that point. And as I said, they had to rest. He also had special food ordered for them. While the soldiers would have salted fish and salted meat, instead Washington ordered that those under inoculation were to have fresh fish and fresh meat because he wanted them to have the best. Inoculation also meant a problem for some of the soldiers, and for New Hampshire's troops, for example, the men that were under inoculation from New Hampshire, it was found that 50% of those, even though they really were not well, they were recovering from a very mild case of smallpox. 50% of them had no blankets or no covering. So this would have been a difficult time for the soldiers. The inoculation was very successful. Very few men died from smallpox, but there was a much higher percentage of soldiers that would have died if they would have gotten the smallpox the normal way. But very few men died or had great difficulties from their inoculations. So it was a great success story of Valley Forge. So look at our next letter, which is J. J is for justice. When you look at the record, you'll see that there are many, many, many court-martials at Valley Forge. These were not a group of all well-behaved soldiers by any means. Punishment was severe sometimes too. Death was what was given if men deserted or if a man was caught spying. Whipping was given for other things, for other things that the soldiers did. Whipping, however, was only to be given to 100 lashes. So while soldiers may have done a crime for which 300 lashes were ordered by the court-martial, Congress decreed only 100 lashes per soldier was allowed as a punishment. And then we have the case of Private John Riley. Private John Riley was sick of Valley Forge. He was tired of guard duty, and so he deserted. However, he was found and he was tried and he was sentenced to death with his court-martial. He was swung off on January the 10th, which is not too distant from when Washington moved the army into Valley Forge, which of course is December 19th. He was hung on the gallows near the Grand Parade on January the 10th, but the rope snapped and he fell to the ground. He was picked up, new rope was strung around his neck, swung out again, and he hung there until he died. And then, as they said, his body was dropped into a hole under the gallows, and he was buried there. Not a pleasant sight by any means, but one that the soldiers in his brigade were ordered to watch, because Washington wanted these punishments to be witnessed as a deterrent to other people. So flogging, hanging, part of the Valley Forge story also.
And so we had a question regarding the women and how their treatment may have differed from the men. So first, regarding inoculation, were the women inoculated? But also with military justice, do you have any examples of women being the subject of military justice?
Yeah, women were inoculated, but not as far as I know at Valley Forge. They may have been inoculated at Valley Forge, but I've seen in other encampments, in other instances where women were inoculated. But as I said, not at Valley Forge. And yes, women were punished also if they committed crimes, for example, like encouraging the men to desert. They were drummed out of the army, which would have been included some sort of flogging or whipping. So yes, they would have been. I have no instance of a woman hung anywhere. Maybe you know of something like that about that, Justin. I don't know,
No.
but they were whipped at times. Yes.
Yeah, sutlering without a license. Yeah, all kinds of
Yeah.
different things.
Yeah. Right. 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 Okay. Shall I continue on?
Yes, please.
All right. So we're to J, and our next letter, of course, is K. And that is General Henry Knox. General Henry Knox was a wonderful friend to George Washington, also an excellent friend to General Nathanael Greene. He's a former bookseller in Boston, which amazed the foreign officers. They, of course, could not believe that a mere bookseller should become a general in an army. It's just not make any sense to them whatsoever. But the American army, as we know, was different. And Henry Knox did become a general, a very valuable one and a very important one. He was the guy who made sure that the cannon moved from Ticonderoga to Boston in 1776 and was invaluable to Washington. His wife, Lucy, came to Valley Forge. She came in May. She had wanted to come much earlier than that, but he did not invite her. He had other things he had to do in those other places. But she came in May with, as we mentioned, Benedict Arnold, and came with their younger daughter, little Lucy, who was 2 years old. Knox commands the artillery. When you think about Valley Forge, you think about General Henry Knox and Lucy Knox, and the love letters that they write to each other are wonderful. Lucy adored her Harry, and he adored his Lucy, and their love letters, as I said, are just delightful. They had 13 children, only 3 lived to adulthood, unfortunately. And he served as Washington's Secretary of War later on when Washington became president. So K is for General Henry Knox. L, here we have the Marquis de Lafayette, a man who I actually have a little problems with, very valuable also to Washington, very valuable to the United States, because undoubtedly he was useful with the French and signing the French alliance. But one thing Lafayette did that still bothers me is that he sailed off from France without telling his wife that he was coming to America. She was pregnant at the time. He did not want to be turned back, and so he just sailed off. And then after he left, he had her informed that he was going to the United States of America. We have some interesting letters that Lafayette writes to his wife, and she writes back to him, because there's a big time delay, of course. Letters take a long time to get one place and another. Soon after Lafayette comes to Valley Forge, he writes that he is very happy to hear that he has another child. another girl. He's very happy to hear that the child has been born, but he tells his wife that she needs to make sure that the next child is a boy. And then at the end of the encampment, he writes to Adrienne, that's her name, that he's very sorry to hear that one of the girls have died. So he's found out that their older daughter has died, and is writing to her and saying, is there any possible way that he could come to home to be with Adrienne, he would do so. But he's not able to do that because he's frankly feels that he's needed here in America and that Washington needs him too. So Marquis de Lafayette, great friend of Washington, of course, almost a father-son relationship between the two of them. When he first comes to America, he hears that the huts are really quite comfortable. But when he actually sees the huts at the Valley Forge Encampment, he says that they are no more pleasant than a dungeon. And speaking of a dungeon, that's where Lafayette spent some of his time during the French Revolution, and his wife and children, his daughters, go and spend time with him also. Their son, George Washington Lafayette, on the other hand, is sent to America for safekeeping. Lafayette's the guy who is playing peekaboo with the British soldiers at the Battle of Baron Hill. And he had a very important role during the Battle of Yorktown. Very important guy to Washington and to America. And a very unusual person because he's only a teenager when he comes to America. Our next letter is M, and M is for Martha Washington. She spends 4 months at the Valley Forge Encampment. She's invited to every single one of the Valley Forge of the encampments during the Revolutionary War, and she goes to every one of them. In fact, she spends 5 years of the Revolutionary War traveling to an encampment or staying at one of the encampments or traveling back to Mount Vernon. When she comes to Valley Forge, as I mentioned, this is what really got me started in this whole thing, because I learned that she went to see Cato. And we find that she also accepts portraits of her husband that are painted at Valley Forge. And why does she come? What is the purpose here? Well, Martha Washington is, as she writes, mad about the general. Or pardon me, it's not that she writes that, Lafayette writes that about her. She is mad about the general. And General Nathanael Greene says Martha Washington is very happy in the general. That's Washington. And Washington is very happy in her. So why is she coming? She loves the guy. And they apparently have a very happy marriage. He, by the way, shows a great deal of respect for her too in the letters that he writes. We have very little, have only 5 letters between the two of them. But every once in a while you can find a reference where he says things like, I bought some linens, but I want to wait for Mrs. Washington to inspect them and for her approbation before I finally settle on that. So he respects her, I think, a great deal. So M is for Martha Washington. Let's go on to N. N, this is the arch here at Valley Forge, and look what it says. Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery. This is a letter that Washington writes from Valley Forge as a ranger, a seasonal ranger. I was taught that naked in this instance doesn't mean that the soldiers are absolutely naked running around in their birthday suits, and starving doesn't mean that the soldiers were starving. But in the research that you do, you find out that this probably is exactly true, that the soldiers were naked. Steuben says, in fact, that the soldiers are naked, some of them in the fullest sense of the word. And starving may not mean that they were actually starving. We don't have any examples of them starving, but we do know what that means for them and their health. We have thousands of, at least 2,000 soldiers that die at Valley Forge, and they cannot be well nourished because their diet is only meat and bread usually. And sometimes we don't even have meat for the soldiers. So that means they're eating bread, no vegetables, no fruit. These are not well-nourished guys by any means. Naked and starving, yeah, maybe not, maybe they were, maybe they were. Maybe some of our soldiers were naked and some of them are starving, perhaps. Let's look at O, orders. What does that mean at Valley Forge? Well, many, many, many orders were given at the Valley Forge encampment. Every day they have them, and they're offer very interesting insights into what was going on camp. You can go on Founders Online on the web. You find the George Washington papers and the Adams papers and the Hamilton papers, the Franklin papers, the Jefferson papers. All of these is really good information. And when you look at the orders from the Valley Forge time, you find that it wasn't until a day after the soldiers actually march into camp that the camp is laid out. At least that's the way that I read it. You also find that although we say on the 19th of December as the soldiers march out, some of them marched out on the 18th of June. I think I said December, I meant June. The 18th of June, not the 19th of June. So the orders give you lots of extra information about what's going on at Valley Forge. Our next letter is P. P for Philadelphia, an elegant and important city during the Revolutionary period. This, of course, is the city where the British Army come into. They come in September of 1777, and they stay there until June the 18th or 19th of 1778. Valley Forge is waiting. The army is waiting. The Continental Army is waiting until the British Army leaves Philadelphia. Then they will follow them, and of course they will engage in the Battle of Monmouth. Philadelphia is where the British Army are. They are also hungry, just as our soldiers at Valley Forge are hungry. So are the British soldiers at Valley Forge. At Philadelphia hungry, and they are foraging just as we are foraging for food during the Valley Forge encampment period. So while the soldiers in Philadelphia have better accommodations, they're living in houses, our soldiers are living in huts. Both of these soldiers are hungry during this period. They did not leave Philadelphia in good shape. It was filthy. It was and smelled abominably. General Henry Knox had planned to take Lucy and his daughter, little Lucy, to Philadelphia to live there, but what they found is that the place smelled so much that they couldn't possibly do that. And so Lucy and little Lucy went to another location to live, although they had planned to live in Philadelphia. And speaking of smells, the Valley Forge encampment didn't smell very good either. The place would have reeked. Q is for Quill Pens. We talked about the orders that the soldiers, that the officers wrote, or Washington secretaries wrote, and they used quill pens to do so. It's interesting when visitors come to Valley Forge and they enter Washington's headquarters, and those who have seen Hamilton are very anxious to see the room where General Hamilton actually worked at Valley Forge, which is, of course, the first room on the right-hand side when you enter Washington's headquarters. Washington had a military secretary and he had an assistant secretary, and all of them had aides or servants or slaves with them, because the men that came and worked for Washington as his secretaries and his aides were gentlemen. And gentlemen during the 18th century have servants or slaves that are with them. Hundreds of letters went out under Washington's signature, And Alexander Hamilton, as I mentioned, is the person who's in charge of the aides during the Valley Forge period. The aides did different things besides write letters. They also escorted Martha Washington to camp, and General John Lawrence, who's General Henry Lawrence's son, and Henry Lawrence is the president of Congress during the time, is one of Washington's aides during the Valley Forge period. Think what a wonderful thing this was, to have the son of the president of Congress right there with you at Valley Forge. All kinds of information could be transmitted back and forth in a very unofficial way, and yet an important way between Washington and the president of Congress. R is for rations. As we mentioned, they were not good during the Valley Forge period. In fact, during the entire Revolution, supplying the army was a problem. There was a difficulty of feeding thousands of men during the entire Revolutionary War. Food was desperately short when the army first moved into camp in December. Food was also very short in mid-February when the weather was particularly difficult. There was lots of mud during that time, hard to get the wagons through. Food was also a big, big problem in late May, early June, when thousands of additional troops came to camp. So rations were never during the Revolutionary time, really lots of them, and certainly during Valley Forge, it was a very difficult time. It's interesting, though, to look at headquarters and see what's going on there, because at headquarters, Washington is being fed and orders much different kinds of rations than his soldiers ate. So on Christmas Day, we find that he has cabbage and butter and eggs and hens and veal and a turkey. His soldiers are not eating anything like that around the Christmas time at the Valley Forge period. Washington even had his own milk cow, which was very nice, I'm sure. And then we have our next letter, which is S for Alice Lee Shippen. Alice Lee Shippen is one of the ladies that come to Valley Forge. We have lots of women that come, between 400 and 800. We also have ladies that come to camp. Martha Washington being one of them. Alice Shippen being another one of them. She comes from a very elite family, the Lee family of Virginia. Two of her brothers are signers of the Declaration of Independence. Alice Lee Shippen lived in Reading for a while, and she also lived in Mannheim, which is kind of near the area where I'm living right now. And she, as I mentioned, is at Valley Forge, and it's very interesting to see what she's doing there. She's the wife of Dr. William Shippen, who's one of the physicians. While she's at camp, you can tell that she is very optimistic and that she's sure that America is going to win. Because she says to her husband, I want you to write to our daughter, who's named Nancy. Nancy's in finished school. And tell her that you want to be sure that Nancy is learning how to enter a room properly, that she's learning how to leave a room properly, that she's learning how to sit and learning how to stand. And I don't want her to wear a bow on her shoulder because it will make her crooked. So you can see that Alice Lee Shippen is thinking ahead. She wants her daughter Nancy to be one of the finest ladies in all of Philadelphia. She's sure America's going to win. When that happens, she knows Philadelphia will become very important, and she wants Nancy to be one of the finest ladies there. And that's what she's thinking about at Valley Forge. T is for Elizabeth Thompson. Mrs. Elizabeth Thompson. This is Martha. This is Valley Forge's housekeeper. She's about 74 when she comes to Valley Forge. She signs on at the age of 72 to travel with Washington. She leaves his service at the age of 77 because age has made it necessary for her to do so. But for 5 years during the Revolutionary War, she travels throughout with General Washington as he moves from place to place. And we know that he lives in at least 150 different places during the American Revolution. She sets up housekeeping for him, each one of those spots. At the age of 81, someone writes to Washington for Elizabeth Thompson and says that Mrs. Thompson is in broken health. She has no money. He wants to know if Washington can help her. And Washington does, sends her money. Congress gives her £100 as an allowance. And then Washington invites Mrs. Thompson to spend her final days in Mount Vernon with the Washington family. Hi, Justin.
Maybe you can shed light on a question I've always had when it comes to management of the household over the winter. I mean, Martha Washington would have control over the domestic sphere, to a certain degree at Mount Vernon. To what degree did she run the household when she was present with Washington over the winters? And would she take on any of the roles in terms of just managing the household? And would Elizabeth Thompson be like a deputy? It's a question that's come up a lot, and I'm curious if you could shed any light on that.
Justin, I'm not sure we have any primary sources of information of that at all. But what my own thinking is this: when Martha Washington came to Valley Forge, part of the time Mrs. Thompson was not there. So in my own head, I think one of the reasons she was not there was because Mrs. Washington took on that role, and Mrs. Thompson became a little superfluous at that point. I think Mrs. Washington felt very comfortable in the role, certainly, and she could manage households very, very well, and certainly did that at Mount Vernon. And so as far as my thinking goes, she would have no problem at all taking care of that role at the encampments. Whether or not she actually did that, I don't know, except I think it is very telling that Mrs. Thompson was not there all the time. Certainly, if Mrs. Washington would have needed her, she would have been there.
Right.
That's the way I would think about it. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see. Okay, so we're T. Our next letter, of course, is U, USA button. The archaeological digs at Valley Forge have been several of them, very exciting. And one of the digs near Washington Memorial Chapel, they found this wonderful USA button. Very exciting when that was discovered. There have been USA buttons found at, I think, almost all of the encampments in several different spots. The archaeologists think that this may have been made because the uniforms were not united. They did not look exactly alike by any means. The soldiers wear uniforms of many colors and many kinds, but the buttons could be the same. And a point of pride, right? To be wearing a button that says USA, United States of America. This is not the United States Army. This is the United States of America. This is the Continental Army, not the United States Army. But very exciting. A USA button found at Valley Forge. Our next letter, as we march along, is V, Valley Forge Farmlands. We cannot forget, but too often we do. These poor farmers that were living on the 3,600 acres here. This was farmland. When this army came in, the soldiers would have taken over. We have 2,000 huts that have sprouted on the land here. And I can't think that the farmers could have been too happy about this. They would not be able to do their planting. They would have knocks on the door all the time. We need your cow, we need your horse, we need your wheat from the field. And that would be taken from them. Of course, they would be getting a little piece of paper that said you'll get some money back but who knows if they did. There are all kinds of claims, both by the British, that the British Army came and took things from the farmers, as did the American Army do this. All kinds of claims and all kinds of things that they took. So it was a very difficult time for those that were living near the armies when they camped out. And certainly we have to remember them and respect them. And W, moving down, almost finished with our alphabet, we have to remember General George Washington, already being called the friend and father of us all at Valley Forge. He, as I mentioned early on, was very much afraid the Army was going to starve or disperse or dispense at Valley Forge, but fortunately that did not happen, partially because of some of the generals that I mentioned, and certainly the women that were there at Camp 2. He turned 46 at Valley Forge. His wife, Martha, turns 47 at Valley Forge. Knox says that all the cares of the time has made him look much older. Washington says of the time, no one longs for domestic tranquility more than I do. He writes this from Valley Forge. And Martha says, sometimes after her encampments, I'm so exhausted from visiting the camps that I cannot visit you. This took a lot out of both George and Martha Washington, but they certainly did their duty, and we remain extremely grateful to them. X marks the spot of the Conway Cabal. While many of the officers and soldiers respect and love Washington, not everybody did. Charles Conway writes that Washington was a weak general. This, of course, incensed Washington no end. And there are some others that believe that too, like Gates, for example. Remember, Gates is winning up at Saratoga while Washington is losing down with Brandywine and Germantown. Some members of Congress, too, thinks that Washington needed to go. So many support Washington, will serve under no other general but him. Some support Conway and Gates to be in charge of the Army. And we have what's called the Conway Cabal. And that's a big issue and very much a concern of Washington during the Valley Forge period. Why is the Yellow Springs Hospital?
Nancy, we had a quick question. Was that Thomas Conway, not Charles Conway?
You're right. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
absolutely.
From one of the attendees.
Very good thinking on somebody's part. Thank you. Totally. Thanks a lot. Why Yellow Springs Hospital? First Army hospital built. This is where the soldiers from Valley Forge go to rest and recover, some of them from smallpox, some of them from other illnesses, anything that would run through the Army. And at the end of the encampment, sick soldiers are left at Valley Forge and then transported to Yellow Springs and to the other hospitals that are around. Washington visited the Yellow Springs Hospital himself. And he missed there on May the 13th of 1778. And the doctor said that Washington spoke to every man in his bunk, which pleased them all exceedingly. And now we come to Z. And Z is Azor. Sort of cheated here. My talk is Valley Forge from A to Z. And so Azor, it represents Z. Who is Azor? Well, Azor is Baron Steuben's dog, who comes to Valley Forge too. I mentioned that the French cook took one look around and said, no, 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 and left. Azor had no choice. So if you'd see Steuben marching around the parade ground, you'd also see Azor following, trotting behind. Steuben thought so much of Azor that he, in his will, bequeathed the dog to Martha Washington. And he said that should he, Steuben, died, the dog was to go to Martha Washington, who loved dogs herself. Martha Washington and Steuben thought a great deal of Martha Washington and a great deal of Azor, and wanted Azor to go to the best. So Martha Washington to get to Azor. Instead, Azor dies before that happened. So we've kind of gone through the alphabet here. I do have a handout. I'll show it to you. If any of you want to go through the alphabet, Valley Forge from A to Z, there's a little handout that I can send you. And there's my email address, nloan1778@gmail.com. So just email, and I'd be more than happy to send that to you. Valley Forge from A to Z. I think Valley Forge is an extraordinary place. And what we find is that we have some very sad times and some very happy times. We have inoculations, we have hangings, we have supply problems, we have foraging for food. Certainly the soldiers are training at the Valley Forge Encampment. And as I said, it's a very special spot. I invite you all to come to Valley Forge again. Think about it perhaps a little differently. I don't, however, suggest that you, like some of the soldiers, walk around it barefoot. I one time decided that every day during 1 year, I was going to walk around Valley Forge barefoot just to see what that was like. And that lasted for 1 week. And that was the end of that. I never finished that. Certainly we're more fortunate than our soldiers. So thanks so much for listening.
So we have a couple minutes. If anyone has any last minute questions to ask, now would be a good time. But one thing I wanted to say is with Azor, one of the things I like to joke about is the fact that Azor survived the encampment. So when it comes to starving, they were not starving to the extent that they had to eat the dogs. You hear about other parts in American history where they're eating their own shoe leather and every domestic animal in sight. But so puts things a little bit in perspective.
Yeah, we also find at Valley Forge, not everybody was starving either, because when you think of Henry Knox, who was not a small person, and Lucy Knox too, you realize there's always, the exception to every rule, as they say. So not everybody is having a very difficult time there.
I wanted to ask about the playbill for Cato. Was that a performance that happened at some point, a modern performance at the National Park or in Philadelphia? On the slide, you had a playbill that was modern, but
yeah.
Curious if there was a play production that happened in recent history at the park.
I don't know if that was done at the park. This certainly was done at a more recent time, and it's kind of a spoof on the Cato thing too. Yeah, it was not done at the park, but wouldn't it be very interesting to do a Cato thing sometime at Valley Forge? I think that would be a very fun thing to do. I think you can even find it online, maybe. So the play, what do you call it? The script, yeah. Right. Yeah.
So, Cato, there is an interesting article in the William and Mary Quarterly, if anyone would like to look that up. In the past, we used to view it as sort of an open air play that all the soldiers visited, but the author of that journal article described it as something that was more for the officers. Is your understanding that it was performed in the bakehouse?
Now there's a good question right there, Justin, right? I remember that saying in the bakehouse, but where the bakehouse was, who knows? Yeah. And what the bakehouse was, who knows? I definitely don't think the bakehouse is what sometimes we call the bakehouse, which is on the corner of 23 and whatever that other road is there where the light is. Yeah. It was performed, of course, by the officers. And yeah.
Yeah, and the attendees being officers.
And ladies, numerous and splendid, right? And the ladies. And it sounds like they also had invited people from neighborhood too to come too. That there may have been some appropriate people that would have come from there too. Right.
So I think that wraps up all the questions from our audience. and I very much appreciate your time. This was an excellent exploration of several aspects of the Valley Forge encampment. And it's great to have an overview and get into the nitty-gritty of some of these little details that are often overlooked. So thank you sincerely for joining us. This has been great.
Thanks, Justin. It's good to see you. Best wishes to you. Thank you.
Likewise. All right. Take care then.